The auditorium smells faintly of polished wood and dust, the kind of quiet place where whispers echo louder than shouts. Rows of students sit stiffly, teachers lining the walls, unaware that in just a few moments, silence will fall so heavy it feels like the air itself has stopped breathing. On that small school stage stands a 7-year-old boy, Michael Jackson, about to turn years of fear into a moment no one would ever forget. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. The story begins not with applause, but with pressure. At 7 years old, Michael Jackson was already different. Smaller than most boys his age, soft-spoken, with eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him, he moved through school hallways like a shadow trying not to be noticed. Fame had not yet wrapped him in armor. At school, he was not Michael Jackson. He was just a quiet kid with a gentle voice, and that made him an easy target. The bullies never saw the stage lights. They didn't know about the hours of practice at home, the rhythms that lived in his bones, or the melodies he hummed when he thought no one was listening. They saw only what was in front of them, a boy who didn't fight back. Teasing started small. Snickers during class. Notes passed behind his back. Then it grew sharper. Words meant to cut, to remind him every day that he didn't belong. Michael Jackson tried to ignore it. He told himself that silence was safer. But silence has weight, especially on a child. Every laugh at his expense stacked like stones on his chest. Every day he carried them home, and every night he lay awake, replaying moments he wished he could erase. Yet somewhere deep inside, something else was growing, an instinct older than fear, an urge to express what words could not. The school announced an assembly. A routine event. Teachers expected polite clapping, children expected boredom, and bullies expected another day where nothing changed. The stage was decorated simply, curtains hanging heavy, microphones adjusted too high for small hands. No one anticipated what would happen when Michael Jackson's name was quietly added to the program. When he was told he would appear on stage, his heart raced. This was not the same as singing at home or practicing in private. This was the place where the bullies sat, where their laughter echoed loudest. The thought of standing in front of them made his stomach twist. But something unexpected happened. Instead of fear, a calm settled over him, a calm born from exhaustion. He had had enough. Backstage, Michael Jackson stood still, listening to the muffled sound of the crowd. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves alone, but from the weight of everything he hadn't said. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about releasing something that had been trapped inside him for far too long. When his turn came, the announcer's voice echoed his name through the hall. A few students whispered. Some laughed. Teachers watched with mild curiosity. A small boy stepped into the light. At first, there was noise. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. Then Michael Jackson moved. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. Music began, soft at first, almost shy. His body followed the rhythm instinctively, as if the sound had unlocked something hidden. The shy boy from the hallway was gone. In his place stood a performer with an intensity far beyond his years. Each step carried purpose. Each turn, each gesture told a story words never could. It wasn't just a performance, it was a confession. Anger, pain, resilience, hope, all woven into movements so precise it stunned the room. The bullies stopped smiling. Teachers leaned forward. Children who moments before were restless now sat frozen, and then, something extraordinary happened. The room went completely silent. No whispers. No laughter. No movement. Just the sound of music and the sight of a child expressing emotions too powerful to ignore. Michael Jackson's eyes were focused, distant, as if he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere safe, somewhere where no one could hurt him. In that silence, the power shifted. The bullies, once loud and confident, shrank into their seats. They were no longer in control. For the first time, they were forced to see him, not as a target, but as a force. When the music ended, Michael Jackson held his final pose for a breath longer than necessary. It felt like time itself hesitated. Then the applause erupted, not polite clapping, but a wave of sound that crashed over the stage. Teachers stood. Students cheered. Faces that once mocked him now looked on with awe. The bullies didn't clap at first. They couldn't. Their power had dissolved in that moment of silence. Some eventually joined in, unsure, humbled by what they had witnessed. Michael Jackson walked off the stage quietly, the same way he had walked on. But everything had changed. That assembly became legend in the school. Not because of rebellion or confrontation, but because a child had found a way to speak without words. The bullying didn't disappear overnight, but it lost its teeth. Something about him had shifted. People saw him differently. More importantly, he saw himself differently. For Michael Jackson, that moment was more than a victory over bullies. It was a revelation. The stage wasn't just a place to perform, it was a place to heal. A place where pain could be transformed into beauty. Where silence could be louder than cruelty. Years later, the world would watch Michael Jackson command stages far bigger than a school auditorium. Millions would scream his name. But the foundation of that power, the emotional honesty, the intensity, the vulnerability, was forged in moments like this one. Moments when a frightened child chose expression over fear. This story isn't just about talent. It's about resilience. About the quiet strength it takes to stand up in your own way. Michael Jackson didn't fight back with fists or insults. He fought back with art. And in doing so, he taught a room full of people, and eventually the world, that true power doesn't shout. It resonates. That assembly ended like any other on paper. Students filed out. Teachers returned to class. But something invisible lingered in the air, something that would never quite leave. The memory of a child who turned silence into a statement, and perhaps that's why this story still matters. Because somewhere, right now, another child feels unheard. Another child is carrying stones on their chest, wondering if things will ever change. The story of Michael Jackson at 7 years old reminds us that even the smallest voice can fill a room, if it finds the courage to be heard. The silence that followed that applause was different from the one that came before. It was no longer heavy or threatening. It was reflective, almost sacred, as if everyone in that room sensed they had witnessed something fragile and rare. Michael Jackson did not bow dramatically. He didn't smile for approval. He simply walked off stage, shoulders slightly hunched, still just a 7-year-old boy carrying a heart much older than his years. Back in the hallway, the noise of the school returned, lockers slamming, shoes scraping against the floor, voices overlapping. But for Michael Jackson, the world sounded different now. The echoes of laughter that once felt sharp had dulled. Not because people had suddenly become kinder, but because he had discovered something stronger than fear, control over his own story. That afternoon, teachers spoke about the performance in hushed, respectful tones. Some admitted they hadn't expected much when they saw his name on the program. Others quietly wondered how a child so young could express something so complex. No one said it out loud, but many felt it. This was not just talent. This was necessity. Michael Jackson hadn't performed to impress. He had performed to survive. In the days that followed, the bullies changed. They didn't apologize. They didn't suddenly become friends. But their eyes no longer searched for him in the hallway. When they did see him, there was hesitation. The power dynamic had cracked. They had seen what lived inside the quiet boy, and it unsettled them. Michael Jackson returned to class like nothing had happened. He still sat near the front, still spoke softly when called upon. But inside, a door had opened. He had learned that the stage was not a place of judgment, it was a shield. A mirror. A voice. At home, music filled the rooms as it always had. But now, when Michael Jackson practiced, there was urgency in his movements. Each note carried memory. Each rhythm echoed that moment on stage when the world had finally listened. He didn't have the words to explain it, but he understood one thing clearly: when he performed, he felt safe. The applause that night at Roosevelt High School did not know what it was applauding. It was clapping for a small boy who had just finished a song. But history, looking back, understands it differently. That applause was the first quiet acknowledgement of a transformation, one that would take decades to fully reveal itself to the world. When Michael Jackson stepped off that stage, his heart was still racing. The fear hadn't vanished completely, but it had been conquered. Catherine pulled him close, wrapping him in her arms, whispering words no one else could hear. Joe nodded once. Nothing dramatic. No celebration. In the Jackson household, success was expected. But inside Michael, something irreversible had happened. That night planted a seed that in the days that followed, Michael replayed the moment again and again in his mind. The silence. The panic. The smile. The song. He didn't yet have the language to describe it, but he had discovered something essential. Performing wasn't about being perfect. It was about pushing through fear and finding connection on the other side. As the Jackson 5 continued performing around Gary and nearby towns, Michael began to change. He watched audiences closely. He learned how energy moved through a room. He noticed how eye contact mattered, how timing mattered, how emotion mattered more than technical perfection. Even at such a young age, Michael Jackson was studying the stage like a scientist studies a living organism, and always, somewhere in the crowd, Catherine was there. She remained his anchor. When performances went well, she smiled. When they didn't, she reassured him quietly. She never pushed him into the spotlight, but she never let him retreat from it either. That balance, between protection and encouragement, became one of the invisible forces shaping Michael's life. By the late 1960s, the Jackson 5 were no longer just a local curiosity. Their sound had matured. Their harmonies tightened. And Michael's voice, once fragile with fear, had grown astonishingly powerful. When he sang, people stopped talking. When he danced, eyes followed instinctively. Motown noticed, Berry Gordy saw what others were beginning to sense, that Michael Jackson wasn't just another child singer. He was a once-in-a-generation performer. When the Jackson 5 signed with Motown, the leap from high school stages to national television happened almost overnight. Ed Sullivan. The Hollywood Palace. Nationwide tours, yet even as millions watched him perform with confidence and charisma, few understood the cost. Fame did not erase fear, it buried it deeper. Each performance carried the weight of expectation. Each note had to be perfect. And the world was far less forgiving than a Gary, Indiana audience. Behind the scenes, Michael worked relentlessly. He rehearsed obsessively. He listened to recordings of himself, searching for flaws no one else could hear. He watched legends, James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Sammy Davis Jr., and absorbed every movement, every breath, every pause. But no matter how famous he became, the memory of that first freeze never left him. Years later, when Michael Jackson would stand alone on massive stages, surrounded by screaming fans and blinding lights, he would still feel the echo of that 6-year-old boy's fear. It manifested as nerves before every show, as self-doubt in moments of silence. Yet instead of paralyzing him, it drove him. Fear became fuel. As his career evolved, Michael began to understand something deeper. Vulnerability was not weakness. It was power. Audiences didn't just love his talent, they felt his emotion. His performances carried a sense of urgency, as if every song mattered because it might disappear if he didn't give everything to it. This understanding shaped his artistry. When the Jackson 5 eventually transitioned into Michael's solo career, the pressure intensified. The safety of brothers was gone. The spotlight was singular. Albums like Off the Wall and Thriller weren't just collections of songs, they were statements. Proof that the boy who once froze could command the world. Yet behind the success, Michael remained haunted by the idea of failure. Friends and collaborators often noticed how deeply he cared. How criticism cut him more sharply than praise healed him. How he constantly sought reassurance, even at the height of his fame. That emotional sensitivity, so often misunderstood, traced back to moments like that night in 1965. Because Michael Jackson didn't learn confidence from ease. He learned it from survival. As decades passed, stories of his childhood took on mythic proportions. Some painted it as purely disciplined, others as harsh. But moments like the Roosevelt High School performance reveal a more complex truth. It was shaped not only by control and pressure, but by quiet acts of love that changed trajectories. Katherine Jackson never stepped into the spotlight. She never sought credit. Yet her influence lived on in every performance Michael ever gave. In the way he reached for connection. In the way he poured emotion into his voice. In the way he refused to give up, even when fear tried to silence him again, and fear did return, many times, during world tours, before televised performances, before historic moments like the Motown 25th anniversary, Michael felt the same tightening in his chest. The same racing thoughts. The same possibility of freezing. But each time, he remembered, consciously or not, that fear could be survived. Motown 25 would become one of the most iconic performances in music history. The moonwalk. The glove. The scream from the audience. But behind that flawless execution was a man still battling the same inner voice that once whispered, "You can't do this," and every time he stepped forward anyway, he won. Looking back, it's tempting to romanticize the struggle. To frame it as destiny. But in reality, it was fragile. Had Katherine reacted differently that night, had she panicked, scolded, or pulled him off stage, the story might have ended there. There might never have been Thriller. No Billie Jean. No Man in the Mirror. Music history often turns on moments so small they're invisible in real time. A smile. A gesture. 10 seconds. As Michael Jackson grew older, his relationship with the stage became increasingly complex. It was both sanctuary and battlefield. A place where he felt most alive, and a place where his deepest fears surfaced. Yet he kept returning, night after night, performance after performance, because somewhere inside, he was still that child searching for reassurance, and finding it in the connection with an audience. Fans sensed it, even if they couldn't explain it. They felt seen by him. Understood. His vulnerability made his performances feel intimate, even in stadiums filled with tens of thousands of people. That emotional honesty separated him from other performers. It's why his music endures. Long after his passing, people continue to watch his performances, dissect his movements, analyze his voice. But the essence of Michael Jackson cannot be reduced to technique. It lives in moments of courage, when fear was present, but he sang anyway. The night of May 22, 1965, is rarely mentioned in official timelines. It doesn't appear in highlight reels or award montages. Yet it may be the most important performance of his life, because it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about discovering that he could stand in fear and still move forward. As the world remembers Michael Jackson as a global icon, it's worth remembering the child behind the legend. The boy who once forgot every word. The mother who believed in him when he couldn't. The 10 seconds that quietly reshaped music history. If this continuation deepened your understanding of Michael Jackson, if it reminded you that greatness is often born from moments of doubt, then let this story keep traveling. The story does not end with applause, or with Motown, or even with the roar of stadiums decades later. It continues quietly, invisibly, inside the mind of a child who learned very early that the stage could both terrify and save him. To understand Michael Jackson, you have to follow that thread forward, through time, through pressure, through fame, and watch how that first moment of fear kept echoing, shaping every choice he would make. In the months after the Roosevelt High School performance, something subtle shifted in the Jackson household. Michael rehearsed with more intensity, but also with more intention. He wasn't just memorizing lyrics anymore, he was learning how to feel them. When he sang, he imagined faces. When he danced, he imagined emotion traveling through his body. It was no longer enough to simply perform. He needed to connect. Joe Jackson noticed the change. He pushed harder, expecting more. But Katherine noticed something else. She saw that Michael had crossed an invisible threshold. The stage had become real to him, not just as a place of obligation, but as a place of identity. At school, Michael was quiet. Withdrawn. Music became his language, his refuge. Other children played games, Michael replayed melodies in his head. Other children imagined futures, Michael imagined stages. The world outside music felt distant, blurry, unimportant. that isolation would later be misunderstood. People would say he never had a childhood. But the truth was more complicated. His childhood didn't disappear, it transformed. It lived inside rhythm, harmony, and performance. As the Jackson 5 schedule intensified, Michael began to experience something many child performers face but rarely articulate: the split between who you are and who people expect you to be. On stage, he was electric. Off stage, he was fragile, sensitive, deeply introspective, and always, there was the memory of freezing. That memory became a quiet promise to himself: never let that happen again. By the time the Jackson 5 reached national fame, Michael Jackson had developed rituals before performances. He would retreat inward. Focus. Breathe. Visualize success. These habits weren't superstition, they were survival mechanisms born from that first dramatic silence on stage. When cameras rolled, Michael transformed. His fear didn't vanish, it sharpened him. It made his movements precise, his voice urgent, his presence undeniable. The boy who once couldn't remember a word now commanded attention without speaking, yet behind the scenes, the cost mounted. Michael grew hyper-aware of mistakes. A missed note haunted him. A misstep replayed endlessly in his mind. Perfectionism became both shield and prison. He chased an impossible standard, not because audiences demanded it, but because fear whispered that anything less could lead back to that frozen moment. As a solo artist, that pressure multiplied. Albums like Off the Wall brought freedom and responsibility. For the first time, Michael wasn't just the youngest Jackson, he was an artist defining himself. He experimented with sound, with style, with vulnerability. Songs weren't just catchy, they were confessional. Then came Thriller. The world saw confidence, innovation, dominance. What it didn't see was the anxiety behind the scenes. Michael worked obsessively. Re-recorded vocals endlessly. Rehearsed choreography until exhaustion. Success didn't calm him, it raised the stakes, because now, freezing wasn't just personal failure. It would be public collapse. Still, he kept going. The Motown 25 performance in 1983 is often described as the moment Michael Jackson became immortal. The moonwalk. The silence before the scream. The eruption of applause. But those who knew him understood the deeper significance. That performance was a direct answer to 1965. Standing alone on stage, without his brothers, Michael faced his greatest fear: isolation in the spotlight. And instead of freezing, he transformed silence into suspense. He controlled the pause. He owned the moment. What once paralyzed him now empowered him. The irony is striking. The same fear that nearly ended his career became the engine of his greatness. Because Michael never performed casually. Every appearance mattered. Every audience deserved everything he had. As years passed, his relationship with the stage grew increasingly spiritual. He spoke of losing himself in performance, of becoming a vessel. Some misunderstood this as eccentricity. Others recognized it as transcendence, but the root was always the same: fear transformed into purpose. Even during the most challenging periods of his life, media scrutiny, personal struggles, isolation, Michael returned to the stage. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Because it was where he first learned he could survive terror and emerge stronger. And Catherine was always there, quietly, unwaveringly. Even as fame complicated everything, her role remained constant. She never claimed credit. She never told the story for attention. But her presence echoed in Michael's resilience. In interviews, Michael often spoke about love, its absence, its necessity, its power. That belief didn't come from abstract philosophy. It came from lived experience. From a mother's smile that told a terrified child he wasn't alone. That lesson shaped his music. Songs like Man in the Mirror and Heal the World weren't branding, they were reflections of a man who understood vulnerability. Who believed that compassion could change outcomes. Who had seen firsthand how a small gesture could alter destiny. As time went on, Michael's perfectionism intensified. His sensitivity deepened. The world expected him to be invincible, but he remained human. And humanity, for him, was inseparable from fear. yet he never stopped performing, even in his final years. Preparing for This Is It, Michael rehearsed with the same intensity he had as a child. Observers noticed his focus, his drive, his need to get it right. That drive wasn't about legacy, it was about truth. About honoring the stage that once tested him. When we look back now, it's tempting to frame Michael Jackson's life as a series of spectacular moments. But the truth lives in quieter spaces. In the seconds before a song begins. In the breath before a note. In the memory of a child who once stood frozen under lights too bright. That child never left him, and perhaps that's why his performances still resonate. Because they weren't just entertainment, they were acts of courage. Each song was proof that fear could be faced, that silence could be broken, that vulnerability could become strength. The night of May 22, 1965, doesn't belong only to history. It belongs to anyone who has ever frozen under pressure. Anyone who has felt the weight of expectation. Anyone who has needed someone to believe in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. That's why this story matters, because it reminds us that legends are not born fearless. They are born human, and shaped by the moments they choose not to give up. The silence after that smile never truly disappeared. It followed Michael Jackson through every decade of his life, reshaping itself, evolving, but always present, like a shadow that reminded him where he came from and what it cost to stand in the light. As Michael grew older, the world began projecting myths onto him. Genius. Prodigy. Phenomenon. But inside, he carried memories that no headline ever captured. The sensation of forgetting everything. The terror of disappointing those watching. The feeling that love could vanish if he failed. That emotional wiring, formed so early, became the architecture of his soul. By the early 1970s, Michael was no longer just a child star. He was growing up under a microscope. His voice changed. His body changed. The world watched closely, waiting for signs that the magic would fade. Many child stars before him had disappeared the moment innocence gave way to adolescence. Michael knew this. He felt it, and fear returned, different now, but just as powerful. This time, it wasn't about forgetting lyrics. It was about losing relevance. Losing love. Losing the stage that had become his identity. The same stage that once terrified him now felt like the only place where he truly existed. That contradiction tore at him. When Michael began fighting for creative independence, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. He needed control not for ego, but for safety. The stage had taught him that uncertainty was dangerous. Preparation was protection. Perfection was armor. Every beat he approved. Every harmony he refined. Every visual detail he obsessed over. These weren't excesses, they were coping mechanisms forged in childhood fear. People often asked why Michael Jackson worked so hard when he was already the biggest star in the world. The answer lived in that 6-year-old boy, because somewhere deep inside, Michael still believed that if he slipped, if he froze, everything could vanish. As MTV changed the music industry, Michael changed with it. He didn't just make videos, he told stories. Cinematic, emotional, larger than life. Yet at the center of every spectacle was vulnerability. A lone figure dancing in the dark. A voice breaking through silence. Take Billie Jean. The song is confident, defiant even. But watch his performances closely. The pauses. The stillness. The way he holds silence before movement. That control over fear, over anticipation, was learned the hard way. Silence had once betrayed him. Now, he mastered it. When audiences screamed, when the lights exploded, when the world seemed to orbit around him, Michael often felt detached. Fame amplified everything: joy, pressure, loneliness. The higher he climbed, the further he felt from ordinary human connection, yet the stage remained sacred. It was the one place where fear transformed into clarity. Behind the scenes, Michael often rehearsed alone, long after others had left. He refined movements not for applause, but for reassurance. Every perfect step whispered to that frightened child, "You're safe now." You didn't freeze, but safety was fragile. The media scrutiny of the 1990s intensified his anxiety. Accusations. Mockery. Invasion. The world that once celebrated him now questioned him. Old fears resurfaced, not of forgetting lyrics, but of being misunderstood, abandoned, erased. Once again, the instinct was the same: retreat inward, then return stronger. Michael poured himself into music that spoke of pain, injustice, and longing. They don't care about us. Stranger in Moscow. These weren't just songs, they were emotional diaries. Confessions from someone who had learned early that silence could be deadly, and still, he performed. Each performance was an act of defiance against fear. Against collapse. Against the possibility of freezing under the weight of the world's gaze. In quieter moments, Michael reflected on childhood with mixed emotions. There was pride, sadness, gratitude, regret. But one memory remained pure: his mother's presence. Her belief never wavered, even when the world did. Catherine's role wasn't loud or dramatic. It was constant. And constancy, for Michael, was everything. As he aged, Michael became increasingly aware of legacy, not just musical, but emotional. He wanted his work to heal. To comfort. To remind people that they weren't alone. That desire came directly from that first experience of terror and rescue, because Michael Jackson knew what it felt like to be lost on a stage, surrounded by eyes, unable to speak. And he knew what it felt like to be saved, not by force, but by love. That understanding infused his philanthropy, his messages, his obsession with innocence. Critics misread it. But at its core, it was about preserving the moment before fear takes over. The moment where belief can still intervene. When rehearsals began for This Is It, Michael was no longer the boy or the young man the world remembered. His body was fragile. His spirit exhausted. Yet witnesses described moments of brilliance, flashes of the performer who had never truly left. Even then, before each run-through, he prepared meticulously. Focused. Visualized. Centered himself. The ritual remained. Fear never left him, but neither did courage. Looking back now, the night of May 22, 1965 feels less like an origin story and more like a thesis statement for an entire life. Everything that followed, the triumphs, the struggles, the contradictions, can be traced back to those 10 seconds of silence and a mother's smile. That's the paradox of Michael Jackson. The greatest performer in history was shaped not by confidence, but by fear, and by learning how to move through it. When fans watch his performances today, decades later, they feel something beyond entertainment. They feel sincerity. Urgency. Humanity. Because every spin, every note, carries the weight of survival, and maybe that's why his legacy endures, not because he was flawless, but because he was brave enough to keep singing after the silence. If this story has stayed with you, if it has changed how you see Michael Jackson, not as a distant icon, but as a human being forged in fear and love, then keep this story alive. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to believe that even the most terrifying moments can become the beginning of something legendary, because history doesn't always change with thunder. Sometimes, it changes with a smile in the dark.